Cool. Hey, so yeah, thank you so much for sticking around. I'm really excited to talk a little bit about some of these programs for continuing education that I run at work. So, Rachel introduced me as K-Wu. That's what everybody calls me, but it is short for Katherine Wu. So that's where that nickname comes from if you haven't met me yet. I have been a Ruby developer actually at New Relic for the last 2 years. So I've sort of been incognito here a little bit. But I did go to a Python boot camp in San Francisco called HackRight, which is how I got my start in engineering. So today, what I would like to talk a little bit about, I'll first do a brief introduction to these programs on continuing education that I run at work. Then I'll talk a little bit about the various aspects for why I think these are really good ideas and that you should try to run them as well. Next, I will cover the kind of core part of my talk, which is the 3 general principles that I think are really key to running successful continuing education programs. We will then take a look at some of the implementation details of all of these programs, applying those 3 general principles, and then I will wrap up with just a couple final thoughts to leave you with. I should have a tweet that's gone out with my slides, so those will be available very quickly. So to talk a little bit about what these 2 programs actually are, the first one is Technical Book Club, which is where we read technical books, approximately 1 to 2 chapters a week, and then we meet for an hour to discuss with a group of anywhere between 2 and 20 people. I've been running this for just about a year now, and on a week-to-week basis, it seems like not a big deal, but in the past year, we are already now on our 6th book, which is pretty cool, I think. You'll see from this list that half of them are Ruby-specific books, like since we are mostly a Ruby shop at New Relic, but half of them are not. Half of them are other architecture and pattern kind of books. So we can talk a little bit about those titles afterwards if you're interested. So that's the first program. The second program is something that we call LunchConf, which is where we meet weekly and we watch 30-minute-long conference talks while we're eating lunch together, and then have a discussion afterwards. And so this is usually runs around 10 to 15 people or so. And so since May, we have watched 21 different talks across just once a week across these lunches. And the topics range from language parsing to refactoring to performance to all sorts of other things that are pretty cool there. One of my favorites is a talk by Amy Wibowo about hacking a sweater knitting machine, which I thought was super cool. So now let's talk a little bit about why I think these programs are a really good idea. Well, to collect some quotes from people, Book Club gives me shiny hair and clear skin, and in just 3 visits, LunchConf already made me grow 2 inches taller. So yeah, totally true, and that was my best attempt at an infomercial voice. But in terms of actual real-life quotes from people, one person said that our slogan for book club should be all of the learning and none of the stress, as compared to classes and doing homework and exams and things like that. Another quote about LunchConf was that watching it was a whole different experience when you got to discuss them with other people immediately afterwards. And so to go further in depth into kind of why these programs can be really beneficial to people, I'd like to break it into 3 parts. So the first part is why continuing ed generally. The second is why group learning. And the third is why doing at work is really helpful for these programs' success. So the first one, why continuing ed? Well, just fundamentally, it's really fun, right, to learn new things. I think we all really enjoy that, hence being at a conference over our weekend here. Doing things like continuing ed gives you a break from the day-to-day things that you might be working on, and it also really helps keep your excitement alive for whatever industry you may be working in. More specifically, I think it can be really good for your current job because there's a lot of things that you'll go over where you can apply directly to work. For example, one person mentioned after we watched that talk on parsing that she used that non-greedy regex in researching a customer issue for her. And so we have cover these topics while we're not under pressure to learn quickly, just to deal with a fire. You have the leisure to explore the topic in a little bit more depth. Another person mentioned, I get to notice all the gaps in my knowledge before they become fatal flaws. And so doing these kinds of programs can help prevent fires in the future, so you don't even have to be fighting in them in the first place, hopefully with a little bit more context. In Jonathan's talk yesterday about writing debuggable code, he mentioned it's really good to learn common design patterns, and that's something that we've covered in our book club. Our current book is actually called Patterns of Enterprise Application Architecture, which is very applicable since we're an enterprise software application at this point. Ultimately, regardless of the background that you come from, you can't possibly know everything. And so another aspect in which we've applied this for our current jobs is that New Relic at this point has a very large code base that's several years old. And so one of the early books that we read was a book on refactoring, which is very immediately applicable as well. Even beyond what is going on in your current job, it's also really good for your career, because you can use these experiences to learn the easy way and not the hard way by having to run into those walls yourself each and every single time. Kind of thinking back to Melissa's keynote from yesterday morning and talking about the beginner's mind, throwing yourself into learning these new things helps you get into that mindset of being a beginner many times over, as she had mentioned. And in addition, you have the potential for discovering a new area of interest here. One of the books we had read was about error handling in Ruby, and this led to someone in our group then going ahead and giving a really quick lightning talk about some of the things that we had learned there, which was pretty cool for her. So now to talk a little bit about why group learning. Well, I know it might be a little bit off-putting at first. I know for me, in school at any rate, group projects were always kind of a huge pain in terms of coordinating and getting everything together. But in this context, one of the really good reasons to do something like this is you can use peer pressure in a very beneficial way on yourself. And so for me, a lot of this got started because I got tired of saying, oh yeah, I'll do that someday, and never actually getting it around to it myself. But I found out that I will do things due to peer pressure that I won't when left to my own devices at all. So sometimes people will be like, oh, like, it's really great that you run these programs. It's so helpful. And I'm like, yeah, sure. And I happy to take credit for it. But the secret is I'm basically talking other people into helping me do a thing that I already wanted to do myself. So it's pretty sneaky, but it's been really effective. And in that group setting, we can do a lot of active learning. So from a starting point, not only do you read through the material or watch it the one time, but then you are going over the material a second time in the discussion. You can ask each other questions like, oh yeah, how come chapter 4 says something, but chapter 7 says something else, and it seems like there's a contradiction, and maybe it is something in the book, and maybe there's something in your understanding that can be cleared up. And even if you don't necessarily have an answer, it really helps to know that other people feel the same way and have the same reaction that you might have. One person specifically said that reading, it's the human interaction that is particularly valuable for locking in that knowledge. He went on to note, and I thought this quote was a little bit funny, was he's not a very social person, and yet social learning is the most effective method of learning for him. One of the ways that this plays out is that you can learn more, I think, because if you're doing these sorts of things on your own, for me, I would often end up just taking the author's word for it. I would just be like, oh yeah, it's published in a book, and that I'm holding, it's a physical object, that must mean it's true, right? Totally. Everything on the internet is true. But in the book club discussion, we can work together and try to see two sides of the argument, sometimes more than even two sides, 4 or 5, with people disagreeing with each other, as well as having other people help you learn what might be out of date in the information that's presented there. And so in this last aspect of why this kind of learning mechanism is a good idea for doing it at work, a lot of people have said that this is a huge part of its success, and in large part due to this being a lot more convenient. If it's at work, you already have to be there. Speaking back to Melissa's keynote again, I like the phrase that she used, that not everyone has the privilege of having spare time outside of work to focus on these topics. And so go ahead and do it there to help you progress further. At work, there are also a lot of resources that you may be able to take advantage of depending on the environment that you're in. It's always worth asking to see if you can expense some of those materials, like those books. But in general, having the infrastructure in place can help you take advantage of any extra time you have outside of, again, like the day-to-day grind that might be there. For the content specifically, it really helps to have these discussions with fellow work people because it helps make the material a lot more relevant. When you're able to apply a theoretical concept to something that's in front of you or learn about some other work project that's going on, it brings it home a lot more quickly, I think, and helps you solidify that understanding that you have. And finally, a benefit that I hadn't expected at first necessarily was that doing these programs at work helps you interact with a lot of people that you wouldn't normally. So none of these are restricted to one particular group or team. We have participants from all across different engineering teams, from the support teams, and from the training teams as well. So I really like it because it helps me know more about what's going on outside of my particular little bubble. And I've heard of examples such as like-minded people finding each other to do some pairing exercises with, or finding someone to mentor or be mentored by, thanks to some of those relationships that have developed. So now I'd like to talk about, get into the general principles that I think are really key for success in running these programs. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of the common challenges first, which are, number one, that it adds overhead. It's certainly more coordination than if you were doing something on your own. The second is that you maybe have some hesitancies around getting stuck managing these sorts of programs. Maybe you want to work on other projects later and you don't want to be shackled to having to continue programs like these forever and ever. And the third one is that, since it's not actually your core job, a lot of these things can be really easy to deprioritize and push aside when you have other deadlines that are happening. So the way this is going to work is I'm going to introduce these three general principles and give you a few brief examples of each of them, and then I'll go into more in-depth around the different program details and show how the principles are applied there. So the first one is to make it easy, to address that issue of additional overhead that gets added. In Heidi's talk yesterday, she used another great phrase that I liked, was be productively lazy. Which I am completely in support of. I would like to be able to be as lazy as possible and set that bar really, really low. It just needs to be adequate. The goal is to have just enough involvement that you keep things alive, but not much more than that. Because ideally, there's an option where all people have to do is block off the time and show up. So for example, one of the things I'll be talking more about later is that I recommend setting the same time and place every single week without rescheduling needed. So that's the first point. The second one is to make it decentralized, because much like software, you don't want to become a single point of failure for whether the program continues running or not. So an example of how you might implement this is to document how things are run so that it's very easy for someone else to take over from here. And the third principle to apply is to make it useful, because above all, if you're not getting much out of something, then there's no reason to continue doing it. I'm a big believer in the idea that guilt is useful only if it's productive, and it's not useful if it's paralyzing instead. So you want to set up a positive feedback loop that helps keep momentum going and build on your previous successes there. One way in which we do this is that I recommend, for getting started, that you pick a book that you want to read so that you're already very motivated by the choice of topic to get started with. And so to summarize here, one way to remember these three is EDU. Get it? Get it? I swear, I actually didn't like plan that. I'd had them ordered in like UDE or something, and I was doing practice. This is why doing practice loss is really great. One of the great pieces of feedback I got was like, oh, if you just rearrange it, it's like a really great. No, I forget what it's called. I don't remember. Anyway, so the point is, each of these programs has multiple areas where the principles are applied. So I'll tell you what I did and what I think were the keys to making them work that way. But fundamentally, it's kind of always trying to address one or more of these items here. So let's get into the details. For getting started, as I mentioned, I think if you're the one that's starting it up, you should be the one to get to choose where your starting point. It makes it easy because you're not arguing about, oh yeah, like we could do this or this or this. Like just get started somewhere. And it's really useful because you're already interested in somewhat. So the Technical Book Club got started because I personally really wanted to read this specific book, which is Practical Object-Oriented Design in Ruby. A lot of people had recommended it to me as a really accessible introduction to object-oriented programming, and it was written in a really clear way, and it wasn't super long either. So I thought, oh yeah, like we should just, I would totally love to be able to finish this book. For LunchConf, I got the idea at RailsConf earlier this year, which was another multi-track conference. And looking at the schedule, sadly, I do not have a time turner and cannot be in multiple places at once. Not yet. But I always end up bookmarking them and then saying like, oh yeah, I'll watch them later. But then I don't. And someone was saying, oh yeah, well, I often just watch conference talks at lunch. But again, I figured I would not do that myself. And then I remembered at New Relic, pretty much all of us take lunch between 12 and 1. And so I could use that same strategy as in book club and talk other people into doing something with me that I wanted to do myself. And so I set up a form to collect all of these bookmark talks into a spreadsheet. And so that's just a brief capture of a moment in time for the recommendations list that we have. Okay, so we have a starting point there. Next step is to recruit some participants. I started by gathering a core group after floating the idea to some people to see who else might be interested in reading Pooter, for example, that book with the red cover there. Getting a core particularly interested group involved really helps that program be decentralized because other people are also motivated to keep going with the program as it's run there. After you've got that core group, it's also really helpful to get a mix of experienced and inexperienced people in order to have more interesting discussions because you both get really good questions from the junior folks as well as war stories shared by more seasoned people there. The people that you can try to get in there are those who have maybe gave you the book recommendation in the first place. Because a lot of people, even if they've already read the book or watched the talk before, it turns out they're often willing to reread or rewatch it again to learn some things more out of it themselves. If there are mentors around, they're a great resource for recruiting as well because it's a way that they can very concretely help their mentee without the burden of necessarily setting up like a customized curriculum or anything like that. Then, this point that I'd mentioned earlier again, I think this is really, really important to pick a consistent time and location because I don't know about you, but I hate having to reschedule meetings for a really large group, like the long email chains of, oh, so-and-so is traveling, or like, oh no, I really prefer this time of day. Like, oh, it's so tedious and it wastes a lot of time. And so I think it's better to just accept that sometimes people won't be able to make it, but that's okay because the goal isn't for everyone to make it every time. Remember, we want to make it as easy as possible. So we just want people to know what's going on and it's just always this time and place and it's decentralized from not having to wait on specific people to make it there. Once we have that meeting place and time set up, I'm a really big fan of ground rules to get everyone on the same page there. So in book club, when we started, we basically had everyone go around and say out loud why they wanted to participate and kind of what they foresaw as some of the challenges there as well. And I think there was something quite powerful in everyone saying out loud, like, yes, we want to keep going and we want to finish this book. We commit to doing that. So the first rule of book club is, hopefully I'm not breaking it just by talking about it, but the first rule is come to book club. That's it. It's okay to come even if you haven't done the reading, because people are really good actually about not asking for summaries. They just go ahead and ask questions to keep up in the discussion there. And so again, this is that easy level option where all you have to do is just block off the time on the calendar and then show up. The second rule that we have is that as long as 2 people are around, the meeting will happen. So this is a really easy algorithm for whether or not we're going to keep the meeting and whether we should cancel it. We have canceled a handful of times, but usually we can meet this incredibly low bar of like just 2 people meeting to talk about the book and then continue going. For lunch conf, we really only have the one ground rule, which is that if a talk isn't interesting to you or it's not what you had expected, it's totally okay to get up and leave. The only thing we ask is that you submit maybe some other talk nominations later, but really want to focus on making the experience a really useful and valuable one for everyone that's involved there. In terms of setting up the events, it's really useful to have something like a wiki page that anyone can edit and update for collecting the information there. This is where we record some of those ground rules that we'd agreed upon, which books we had read in the past, which books we might be considering in the future. So it's helpful for remembering like relevant links people might have shared for certain chapters. Like, oh yeah, we just watched a talk on, or we had a chapter about concurrency, and somebody recommended this talk on concurrency if you want to go more in depth on that topic, and putting it all on one page. And of course, it's also really helpful and useful for having a place to send new people to educate themselves on this is what book club or lunch conf is all about, all in one page right there. So for running the events themselves, moderating. For book club, we have, I forget if I mentioned this, we always have 2 facilitators assigned per session. And the responsibilities of these facilitators or moderators, use those words interchangeably, is that they definitely commit to doing all the reading. So we have hopefully at least 2 people that are saying like, oh yeah, this is on me to try to get this all done. And if they can, they should also try to bring relevant work examples when that's appropriate there as fodder for discussion there. So we have these 2 assigned, really the idea is so that there is a backup, and it's going further on that idea of having decentralized management there. The moderators also, they're a little bit more heavily involved early on when the programs are first starting, more just, people are still getting to know each other, finding their groove, and encouraging everyone to talk. But later on, it's really not that much more work than if you were just a participant. And the other thing that helps is if you rotate assignments, it helps reinforce that the program doesn't just belong to the one gatekeeper. And responsibility is shared across all of the people that are participating. And when people bring examples from their own projects that they're working on, you get that exposure to different projects across the company that are happening. Outside of the meetings themselves, I found that it's really great to have a forum for continued discussion. So at New Relic, we do this as in a HIP chat room. That's just what people use as our chat program commonly. And you want just some general forum for this continued discussion so that people can have easy asynchronous participation and continue it amongst themselves. And it's in a decentralized way so that people can coordinate amongst themselves as well. You're not having to, again, go through one person as the gatekeeper or anything like that. At New Relic, people just happen to prefer chat rooms over email mailing lists or groups or anything like that, but those would totally work as well, just someplace where people can reach out and talk to each other. So, sad to say, there comes a point in every program when you do have to think a little bit about resuscitating the attendance. So, as much as you have done all the stuff to make it easy and useful and decentralized and all that, enthusiasm does generally fade a little bit. So that's natural. And the way that I approach that is first to go around and ask people some questions about what's going on. Expressing, totally get that everybody's frequently very busy, but I'm really more seeking information on how we might be more inclusive or how we might be able to make it easier to participate. For example, in our current book, Patterns of Enterprise Application Architecture, the title's kind of a mouthful, I've been reminding people now that we're at a section of the book where it turns out you actually don't need all the background knowledge for the previous chapters up until that point. We're in a section where each chapter is pretty standalone, and so letting people know, all you need to do to be able to catch up next week is just do that 1 to 2 chapters that have been assigned, and then you can catch up on the rest at your leisure. And so it, again, lowers that bar a little bit to try to get them back on track and have that positive feedback cycle again. I'm certainly not above a little bit of light guilt tripping, particularly if we have been using books that are expensed. And in the form I have people fill out for asking for a book, there's just a little check mark that's like, oh yes, I commit to trying to make the meetings as well, just so that commitment is clear. But ultimately, the thing that really helps is to remind people that they're the ones that wanted to do it themselves. No one is forcing them to. This is not an external pressure of any kind, but getting them back to that point where they remember, oh yeah, I actually really wanted to finish this, and I need to make room for this in my life. So once you've finished up one particular round and you're on to trying to do the next iteration, hopefully, for both systems, we have a voting system of some kind, voting and submitting of recommendations. And this really helps because having people be involved in the selection process makes them feel invested about the end selections. Because if people vote for something, then they're that much more likely to come regardless, actually, if it's the thing that they voted for, but if it is, then all the better there. For the book club, when we're choosing the next book, our running list of recommendation actually has a mix of language-focused and not language-focused books on there, sometimes even programming challenges and exercises, things like that. Because this wasn't clear to me before, because I've only really programmed in Python and Ruby, but it turns out that the language of the examples doesn't matter all that much. A lot of times, you might get a classic book, and then you'll find a version of it where it's been translated into a different language of some kind. But we found that those translations get rather poor reviews, actually, because it's pretty difficult to just move an example and then rewrite that example kind of even in an idiomatic version of that language. And so it turns out that even though I don't write Java, for example, I can still understand it as it applies to the current reading that we're going through. And if I don't understand it, then that's what the discussion is for. People can help me take a look at that, or we will find some non-Java example in our code base where this pattern does apply, for example. For choosing the talk, it's a little bit simpler in that I showed you that screenshot of the spreadsheet of talk ideas and nominations that we have. So whoever's running that particular session, the moderator, just goes ahead and picks 3 options, and then people can vote on that. So to wrap up with a few final thoughts here, the first is that you don't have to run these programs forever. The whole point of having it be decentralized is that others can take and run with it. So if you've gotten what you wanted to get out of it already, then you can kind of set it free, and it can, I think you should definitely still consider it a success there. The other item is that what makes something useful or easy in your workplace may very well be different from what works for us. So much like in programming, just go ahead and experiment to see what works. Try something out and then iterate and kind of continuously improving there. So the final thought that I will leave you with is, may your bookmarks decrease in number, and may you achieve all of your learning goals. Thank you. I think I have time for questions. Yeah. Hi. Yeah, totally. So the question was, do I think the format of two people deciding on a book to read, whether that would work versus always having it be by consensus with a larger group? Does that sound right? Oh, sort of restricting it to a size of just two people. Yeah, I think that's like totally. A lot of times, like I said, sometimes it is in fact just two people that meet and continue to discuss a group. I think it's helpful to have to expand it a little bit more than that if there are people around that are interested, just because having one other person hold you accountable is already leaps and bounds above like just relying on yourself. But having two people, three people as like backups for that first person that was holding you accountable can help as well. But again, like adapt it to whatever situation you're in. Like whatever is effective is a good thing. Questions? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, totally. So the question is, at New Relic specifically, perhaps, what is the level of support that we get for these programs? So far, yes, I'm pretty sure this is. For all of the books that we have had, we've been able to expense copies of them for everyone who's asked for it, who wants to participate in book club. Usually we do like one large group order just so that we don't have to file 15 expense reports or whatever. But even if people miss out on that, they usually can just discuss with their manager, like it's a technical topic, we're a technical workplace, that's kind of sufficient in terms of justification. And the book club weekly discussion happens on Mondays at 4 p.m., so well within the workday. And the lunch conf happens on Tuesdays from 12 to 1 in a work conference room, kind of, in terms of resources, using their AV versus huddling around a laptop or something. In terms of time that people spend reading for the book, that varies a lot depending on the individual and the team and just like the time frame. So we, like at New Relic, if you've ever been there for a tour, we have like a little library in a corner. It's like a nice quiet space to work. So I've definitely seen people in there during their workday reading the chapters. I meant to mention this in the talk, but so part of the accountability thing, like book club discussion is Mondays at 4 p.m. Turns out Mondays 3 to 4 p.m. I get so much reading done in that 1 hour. It's really astounding, like reading through real fast. Highly productive hour there. But, again, also during the workday. But if things are busy, one of the reasons I set it on Monday is so that if people do feel pressure like that they can't get it done during the workday, then they do have the option of catching up on the weekends if necessary. But yeah, New Relic is very supportive, and we are always hiring, so come find me. Yeah. Got it. So the question is, it sounds really helpful to have some record of what happens during the discussions, but that might be adding to in terms of like a minutes job of some kind. And so I should have been more clear about that. We don't have a designated note taker or anything like that. A lot of people do take notes, but more in the like I take notes and then never read them again. It's just like the act of writing things down helps me learn things. And so like the minimum that we post to the hip chat room after discussion is what is next week's reading supposed to be and who are the assigned facilitators for next week and what have they been assigned to bring back. And like that's like the minimum we need in order to move forward. if there are related things and people happen to remember them, like, oh yeah, I mentioned this talk like in the discussion, here's the link for it now, I'll post it in the room. Then if that happens, that's cool. And sometimes we have discussions in the room of like, oh yeah, we talked about a thing and it sounded pretty important, but now none of us can remember what it was, so oh well. But yeah, keeping it as easy as possible is definitely the priority goal. Hi. Sure. That's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah. Yeah, totally. Actually, when I first started the program, a few people came just to that first one because they thought it was going to be like lightning talks between different teams and learning about what was going on. And I was sort of like, that sounds great. I would totally attend that kind of thing. I do not have the energy to organize to put it on in a way. So I was definitely inspired by like brown bag lunches or lunch and learns and that format generally. But for me, I had like a list a mile long of conference talks that I wanted to watch, and I was like, oh, I just need a laptop, and then just hit play, and then we're good. So that's kind of why we settled on that program. Other questions? Good. Do you want to do like a wrap up for the day or something?